I'd like to share with you some suggestions about preaching under the topic of public speaking. Let me tell you a little bit about my history. 72 years ago, I preached my first sermon. I was scared to death. I sweat more than I sweat playing football. It was pure agony. Over the years, I've learned that preaching is one of the real privileges of life. I thought I was through preaching when I retired nearly 24 years ago. But I worked with the Foundation for Evangelism, and I had some wonderful opportunities to preach in strange places. I preached in a tent meeting in New Haven, Connecticut, near Yale University. And while I preached, people wandered by through the parking lot. I preached in a little town called Oblong, Illinois, for 4 nights in the school gymnasium. One of my favorite stories I heard in Oblong. Near Oblong is a town called Normal. And the headline on the society page said, "Normal boy marries oblong girl." They were still laughing about that in Oblong. Then I preached in Anchorage, Alaska, and learned that there you needed to communicate through native symbols. Well, then I thought I was through after 8 years. And I've ended up serving 3 churches in retirement for a total of 6 years. And then I thought I was through, and I've spent the last 5+ years doing the service where I live in a retirement center every Sunday afternoon. And you know what? It gets more and more exciting and fun. The gospel is good news, and we need to learn how to share it. When I really became aware of our need for some skill in public speaking was during COVID. When we were shut in, I spent a lot of time watching services online. And there were some wonderful communicators, some people who used the medium very well. But in too many cases, there was a real lack of basic communication principles. When I was in seminary, I blundered into a 2-hour course on public speaking. I wish every one of us would take a course in public speaking. How to connect with the audience, how to use your voice, how to use your face, how not to use your hands. So as I observed, I saw people who had no eye contact with the congregation. I saw people who used a strange, unnatural voice. I saw people who had no idea of how to project their voice to be heard. I saw gestures that looked like a broken windmill, and you had to listen with your eyes closed to even follow what was being said. So I would encourage you to have somebody record you and look at yourself. And here's some questions I'd like for you to ask. First of all, what are my eyes focused on? Do I look at the congregation? Or do I spend all of my time with my iPad or my manuscript? No matter how well prepared a sermon, if it's not communicated, if it's not delivered, it's almost a waste of time. So, where do you look? I wish I could encourage each one of you to preach without a manuscript. Some people do it quite well. Too many of us do it poorly. So let me offer some suggestions about how you can work. I discovered that the hardest thing for me was not writing the sermon, but getting ready to deliver it, to get it in mind, to get some way to help me know what was coming. People used to say, "Preacher, we really appreciate the fact that you preach from the heart." Well, I had a full manuscript in my Bible. I never knew when my memory might fail me. And it was there, but I didn't have to use it. And I think you can cultivate that. Let me make some suggestions that have helped me. My sermons were typed, paragraphs, single-spaced. And my mind will photograph a page. And I can see the paragraphs. I can't see each word. I tried that a couple of times to memorize, and that was disastrous. And I can trust God to help me fill in what I've pondered and worked with through the week. And if we can teach ourselves to photograph the paragraphs. Well, if that doesn't work, find a way to key it. When I do a funeral, I usually talk about the 3 R's: to remember the person, to receive the blessing of God, and to rejoice in the victory that's been won in Christ. One of my favorite Psalms is the 40th Psalm. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined toward me. He heard my voice. He plucked me out of the miry pit. He placed me upon a rock. He put a new song in my heart. Well, that's easy to remember. You can picture God leaning toward you. You can picture God listening. You can picture God then picking you or plucking you up and placing you on a safe place. And you can imagine the new song in your heart. You've got a picture. I've preached on the 23rd Psalm multiple times, but I'm doing it again this week, and I've got a whole new concept. Jesus is the good shepherd, he said. And the psalmist said, "The Lord is my shepherd." I don't have to ask him to be, he is. And as such, takes responsibility for me. Responsibility to see that I'm fed, to see that I'm safe, to see that I'm led. And the next R is my response to the shepherd. So we really work at it. We can get our sermon built into our very fabric of our being, so that we can share it as a conversation between ourselves and others. What does your face say about the sermon? You remember the old song, "If you're happy and you know it"? Are you happy to be in the pulpit this morning? Some of you look like you're in pain, and it is hard work, but you've got good news to share. One of my professors in seminary said, "You better learn to enjoy preaching, because people won't come to church every week to watch you suffer." So when you stand in the pulpit, I've started learning to look out and, before I say a word, smile. I'm glad to see you folks, and I hope you're glad to see me. What does your face communicate? Are you happy to be there? How do you use your voice? All of us have our pet peeves. One of my pet peeves is a preacher who becomes pontifical. One of my good friends was a great guy, a man's man. But when he got in the pulpit, he would say, "Oh God, Argota. And I thought, who is that? I don't know that man, I don't know how to describe, but another thing I've noticed, some people have a holy hiccup. They sort of break their voice while they're talking. And then some of us have this strange way of when we say our most important words, we drop our voice. And you say, what was that? What did you say? A few years ago, several years ago now, I took some singing lessons. I've always enjoyed singing. And my teacher was Chick Davis at Emory and Henry. I was serving a church nearby. And Chick worked with me. It took 6 months for him to break some of my bad habits. I've got a big gap in my teeth. And if you're not careful, you'll... So I was cutting off my sound, and it took him 6 months to teach me to sing, push from my diaphragm, open up my voice so that it comes out naturally. And one day it happened. And that was one of the most exciting moments of my life. He didn't have to tell me that's right. I knew that was right. There was a vibrancy, there was an energy, not loud, but energy that was unmistakable. And through these singing lessons, I learned to use my voice. Not speak up here, but my voice. And my best voice is the lower register. And too many of us use our higher register, and that can't be heard very well. And it's strained. And after that, what I learned in singing, I could preach without killing my vocal cords. So you need to take a deep breath, push from here, open up so that you're not straining to stop what you're doing. Use your natural voice. And your voice is about all you need. All this gesturing and so forth is confusing to people. So, remember I said find a way to remember what you're going to say next? All right, here's your face. Is it pleasant? Is it excited? Here's your voice. Is it being properly used? And then here are your ears. Can they hear you out there? It doesn't matter how brilliant your sermon, if it's not heard, it's useless. I remember in seminary, one of the great theologians came to speak, and I was so excited I was going to hear him. He spoke for an hour. He looked up once or twice. He had no interest in the audience. It was only in his notes. And I had to make myself listen. It was torture. And it's terrible for people to come to church and not be able to hear. So don't drop your voice. Don't become pious. Don't use an unnatural language, but learn to use this gift that God has given. One of the simplest things is to learn to use a microphone. I go to so many places and people say, somebody's speaking and they say, I don't need a microphone. If anybody says that, you insist they use a microphone. And you need to spend time with your sound people. You need to make sure you're projecting the way you think. You need to let them tell you, I can't hear you. I can't understand you. Speak up and hold the microphone here. Very recently, I was in a meeting of the bishops, and one of our most gifted bishops was leading a service. You know where he held the microphone? At his belly button. I don't want to hear his stomach growl. I want to hear his voice, And so many older people quit going to church because they can't hear. And I wonder if you've checked your church sound system. I have to use hearing aids now. And it's really frustrating when you can't hear. So are you sure that you're being picked up out there? Are you listening? Are they hearing? And then come back to your hands. What are you doing with your hands? Sit on them or hang on to the pulpit. People used to kid me about leaning on the pulpit and just talking to people. Well, that's a whole lot better than confusing them with the windmill or whatever. Carolyn and I used to enjoy teasing each other. Carolyn's mother was part French, and she spoke with her hands. And I kidded her one time. I said, honey, if I need to interrupt you, I don't need to speak. I just need to grab your hand. And she would immediately stop. Well, maybe you can't speak without waving, but teach yourself. You say, I'm communicating with my leaning forward. I'm communicating with my voice. And I hope I'm communicating with my smile in this process. So, your voice, they're hearing your gestures. And then, what about your bearing? Is there a sense that something divine is about to happen here? A sermon is not a speech. A sermon is a divine event that God uses to communicate in our time. And we ought to be on spiritual tiptoes. We ought to be agitated about what we're doing. Now, agitated doesn't mean loud or demonstrative. Agitated means vital. One of my favorite stories is the preacher who was very bombastic. He was parading back and forth across the pulpit area with a long microphone cord. And the longer he preached, the more violent he became. Finally, a little girl poked her mother and said, Mama, if he gets loose, will he hurt us? Sometimes I wonder if people don't feel the same way, you know. Find a way to communicate with your body. Are you, they used to caution us in seminary against handling casually the word of truth. It bothers me when I see a preacher come into the pulpit with an iPad. By the way, do you know that you can use your iPad as a teleprompter? There's an app that will allow you to see what you're going to say if you can't preach without notes, so that you're still looking at the congregation over the iPad. And I would encourage you to check that out, see how that might work. When I was district superintendent, I tried to hear my preachers preach so I could represent them in the appointing process. And I kept wondering about a sense I couldn't define. Vitality in preaching is not loud. Sometimes it's soft. And what I finally came up with was the word energy, divine energy, and human energy. Maybe a better word would be authentic. Some very authentic preachers are quiet. Some inauthentic preachers are loud. Some authentic preachers are loud. But it has so much to do with the authenticity of who you are and what you're seeking to communicate. And sometimes it pays just to be human. Suppose you get up enough nerve to try to preach one Sunday without notes. You've got your manuscript, you can pull it if you need to. But about a third of the way into the sermon, it becomes awkward and you realize you're going to have to stop and get your notes. Well, why not just say to the congregation, excuse me, I've drawn a blank and I'm going to have to consult my notes. Then you can get it. They know what's happening. They don't wonder whether you've wandered off or something. And it might be well to start saying, let's you and I work together on this. You be patient with me and you listen carefully. And let's see if we can cooperate with God and see that something divine happens here. Sometimes I ask the congregation, I said, would you like to hear a good sermon today? And they, of course, say, yeah, we'd love to. So I say, well, help me out. I said, do what the psalmist described. You remember I said that earlier? Incline. God inclines toward me. How about you inclining toward me? How about you sitting up straight? Lean forward just a little bit and say by your facial expression, we really expect something good to happen here. You may not believe it, but you'll get a better sermon because you're a better listener. Years ago, an experiment was done with groups of people in communication. Suppose you've got 3 people, 3 people, 3 people, 9 people seated together. You know who gets most out of what's being said? The person in the middle. Because they're not free to doze off or what have you. But they are helped to listen by the people around them to listen. And wouldn't it be great if we became a listening people and you invited your people to be a listening people? Would make all the difference in the world. Even when you're trying humor and it falls over flat, instead of trying to explain it to them, you just simply say, that bombed, didn't it? And just move on. If you have to explain it, it isn't worth sharing again. So become a human being, relax. God's with you. The message you've worked on may not be everything you want, but it's what you got. And just embrace this moment. I was in retirement working on my bucket list. New Zealand, train trip to the West Coast. And I suddenly realized when I was asked to fill in a small rural congregation that the first point on my bucket list was preaching. I used to dread it. I still get uptight. But what a joy it is to have the privilege of saying, hey, folks, I want to tell you about God. God is love. God so loved that he gave. And God takes the initiative. And God's with us. And God will transform our life. Isn't that a joy to say to people, what we're doing here today is important. There's some young person who may hear the call of God upon their life. There's some marriage that may be saved. There's some addiction that may be addressed. The beautiful thing is God's been speaking long before you get in the pulpit. And sometimes we're privileged to reap the benefit of God's work. I remember once I preached a sermon just for a young man. He made a profession that night. And I went to visit him and I said, what was it that I said that moved you? And he said, preacher, I'm sorry. I didn't hear a word you said. Said, God's been working with me ever since last night when you used an illustration of Billy Graham's. And I wouldn't get in the wheelbarrow. I said, I trusted Christ, but I didn't really. And I felt deflated a bit. The sermon I wrote was useless, but God used it in some way anyway. So I would ask you also to think about giving people an opportunity to make a response to what you said. Would you like to come and pray? Would you like to talk with me about what it means to be a follower of Christ? Is there any way I can help in your life and your situation? God is eager to help, and the church stands ready to help. Do we give people an opportunity to respond to what we've said? Oh, and by the way, you need to be physically fit as well. Would you believe that I'll be 90 in a few days? And I still try to work out an hour every day. Now, preaching is not casual. Preaching demands fitness. And just as I need to be fit to play basketball or football or golf, I especially need to be fit to share the good news. So I hope you're exercising. I hope you're watching your weight. I hope you're practicing good health habits, because the treasure you share is shared in earthen vessels. But this earthen vessel needs to be as vital, as alert, and eager as possible. Well, I hope you know that in these inadequate moments together, that I love to preach. And I'm grateful for the privilege God has given me to share the good news. I hope you are too. And I hope you and your congregation will enter into a covenant with each other to hear the word, accept the word, and practice the word. How shall they hear unless someone tell? Thank you, Lord, for the privilege of speaking. So, if this is helpful, God be thanked. If not, find your own way to become a better speaker, a better preacher, a better communicator of the good news. Amen.